Okay, good afternoon everyone. Welcome to this webinar on business planning hosted by Composites UK. I'm Claire Weisel, I'm the Communications Manager for Composites UK and I'll be facilitating this afternoon. Our speaker is Peter George from the Future Materials Group, who will take us through the topic today. We are recording this webinar and we'll share this and a PDF of the slides within the next day or so. And if you have any questions, there's a Q&A box just at the bottom of the screen. You might need to wiggle your mouse if it hasn't come up. But if you put any questions in there, we will go through these at the end. And with that, I will hand over to Peter to begin.
Thanks, Claire. Hi, well, good afternoon, and thanks for joining us. Before I start, I thought I might just say a little bit about Future Materials, just to explain to those of you who aren't familiar with us. We are a group of some 12 to 15 people who assist with putting together growth strategies in advanced materials and manufacturing. We are a team of people on either with 1 or 2 decades of experience in industry in advanced materials, or we have a variety of strong analysts coming with technical degrees and PhDs. Necessarily within advanced materials, we have a strong focus on composites, and so we have had a variety of contacts, both in terms of experience of the more senior people and current experience of most of our analysts. We're about 10 years in establishment. As I said, we're about 15 people, and we've been very successful and doubled our numbers in the last 1 to 2 years. And I'm pleased to say that at the moment we haven't got anybody on furlough or anything like that. I would say where the bullet point here mentions that we help clients, that under the current financial challenges, we are more than happy to talk to clients, and they often offer to propose how they would structure the fees that they pay us for work. The important thing is survival as well as growth. We are based in Cambridge, and most of our work is international. We're either talking to organisations interested in expanding across borders, or we're talking to organisations that are looking at adjacent markets, and in most cases not only investigating the landscape of those, but also developing a successful process for stepping into them is essentially what most people benefit from with our work. My name, as Claire said, is Peter George. I've been working for over 30 years in advanced materials. I'm a materials scientist by degree, and I've had roles in sales management across Europe and Middle East, Africa, marketing globally, as well as strategic management. And I've been involved in developing a variety of businesses as far afield as China and Guatemala. For companies that I've been working for have been Fosroc, for instance, in construction chemicals, additives for concrete, Ciba-Geigy, Dino Industria was involved in for a long time in adhesives for timber production, and I've been working with Huntsman, Gurit and Sygrip very closely with composites, and involved in industries ranging from construction to wind turbine blades, marine and aerospace, etc., as well as semi-processed materials. And a large proportion of the work I've been involved in has been, in those days, involved with adhesives. Today I focus on expansion in these material areas and markets, but also quite a lot of activity in the world of distribution, and often the end use of what we're involved in, or I'm involved in, is automotive or wind energy. So today I thought we might try to attack some of these questions about how to recover and develop business after COVID-19. Firstly, where on earth do we start? Secondly, how do we get some answers? The main question, of course, is what is growing when everything appears to be slowing down? What has COVID-19 got to do with us on a business front, I would say? Obviously, individually, we're all affected. What type of opportunities are there? And why are they opportunities now rather than at all times? So just to set the scene a little bit, this isn't, of course, the first time there's been a recession. There are a variety of questions which come up with regard to this particular one. Will global value chains recover from the short-term disruption? Will there be a certain degree of geographical changes and industrial nationalisation? And of course, for those of us in the UK, how does Brexit layer on top of all of that? Japan has earmarked over $2 billion to help its manufacturers shift production out of China. There's been a lot of outsourcing for a variety of supply chains in Japan across into China, and clearly those have caused some difficulties in the recent past. Likewise, in Europe, European industrial sovereignty is certainly a subject which has come up in a variety of countries, and it's no stranger as a subject to the discussions that are going on here in the UK and also in America. A good example, of course, that has touched all of us is in composites would be the impact of aerospace. Today, this unfortunately is a chart which raises more questions than answers, but it is a useful study which needs to be repeated in order to best estimate exactly where we could be headed. Currently, trying to measure how bad the current crisis is difficult. I write here major reduction in supply chain capacity, potentially greater than 40%. I've had discussions in recent weeks with people who would say that that is actually understating it, and they've seen reductions of 50 to 60%. There's an extremely limited visibility with what may happen going forwards, which is somewhat unusual for this industry when build rates and forward forecasting has often been one of the easier elements of it. The recovery process, which winners are going to emerge? Will there be some rationalization, both of end users, of OEM manufacturers, or of tier ones and tier twos? How is that going to take place? What indeed is going to be in the future? These are all questions that will take some time to answer and need reviewing on a regular basis. And finally, we seem to have spent ages talking about the new normal. Well, we need regularly to readjust exactly what that means in terms of the industry. And I think it's probably important at this stage to point out that while we're not all involved in aerospace, we are all indirectly affected by these activities. I mentioned the Chinese COMAC here. Of course, there may well be a change to the speed with which that the programs that they have come online, and indeed there may well be some changes to how things evolve within the supply chain there. But let's not forget that this is an organisation which will be considerably smaller than Airbus or Boeing. As far as future materials is concerned, it's business as normal. We would say that the planning process that we get involved in with many of our associates and clients is unchanged. There is a process of starting from the beginning and working our way down through this process that you see on the screen here. But before you start, I think it's important that first of all, we should put on an extra activity at the beginning of this, which is to talk about the short-term cash flow. It's very important that at least temporarily, the business that we're talking about has some stability or some chance of short-term survival, rather than rushing off to plan the future while the ship is sinking. When we come to planning, the first thing to do is set the objectives, and it's really important for us to dig right back up as far as possible to essentially the owners and the representative of the ownership and the direction of the company in order to clarify corporate objectives. This is going to set the way we go forwards, but it's also going to be a very useful set of objectives, which by the time we come up with a plan, have to be used to check whether that plan is actually going to fulfill those objectives. The first step that we would get involved in is internally studying the business that we are talking about, the strengths and weaknesses of it, what's unique, what are the advantages that that business has, and how do those apply in the future. What are the weaknesses? We often don't put them down on paper, but there are certainly issues where we need to steer around certain opportunities because we know that we have a weakness there. And from that, what are the opportunities for developing the business that we have, and what are the threats towards developing? Having had some discussion about us internally, we then look externally. And the area of megatrends is the first point where, by and large, we would put COVID-19 into here that may well have some influence on the trends that are affecting us. A study of megatrends is essentially a game of geography, really. We are starting off with such broad concepts that we don't need to be an expert in our own particular business to know that there's an increase in population, that there's urbanization around the world, that the world economy is globalizing, that technology is marching forwards, and that the climate change impacts on the environment, etc., are having an enormous effect on the future of business. So we need to normally look at these and say, what have these trends got to do with us? More importantly, what do our customers, and most importantly, what do they mean for our customers' customers? And it is in looking at those we can work out what is likely to be opportune in the future. COVID-19 just changes the game. Additional to the look at megatrends, what doors are likely to open, what substitution might likely go ahead, what doors are closing, and how we affected directly, and most importantly also how we affected indirectly. Taking a couple of examples, we could highlight issues that are really, first instance, got nothing to do with composites. Biomedical technology, urbanization, shift in the world economy, emissions, obviously got something to do with composites, but there will be a variety of changes that we can see coming through. And I think it's important to follow those down and then take it even further. And I've just highlight some examples of how you would chase these down through the consequences for each trend that comes from a megatrend. On the biosecurity side, let's say it's likely we'll see an interest, a growing interest in antimicrobial interiors, not just in hospitals, but also in houses, in offices, and most importantly in transport as well. Some increasing interest in the health of jumping into your own car as well as a taxi or a train. Construction design is likely to be changed as a result of the current situation. People may be looking in the future at larger space buildings or even open air entertainment. And you can imagine that some of those are going to have consequences for the demand in composite materials, let's say potentially cantilevered beams, etc., could be an interesting potential. Individual travel, transport has always been important to this industry, and current situation, there is no change. Anyone trying to buy an e-bike will know that they are fairly popular. People coming back from relying on public transport and perhaps taking on a small car themselves for their own transport are increasingly looking at electric cars. And there have been a variety of trials during the crisis for delivery of testing equipment and drugs by the NHS, for instance, using drones to supply remote areas. Of course, public transport won't go away, but the interior seating and the whole process of how that's made up is likely to change, and that could also provide a variety of opportunities for the composites industry. International supply chain, there's definitely been a review of the security of that, consequent to a variety of people discovering that directly, indirectly, and very much hidden away, they probably have relied at some point on something coming from China. I wouldn't point the finger at China particularly. I think there are questions being raised about all sorts of different supply chain routes and long supply chains. So there's the domestication, if you like, of tier 1 and tier 2 and material suppliers for all industries provides a threat and an opportunity, but certainly a landscape which needs a bit of closer study. And I'll come back to it slightly later, but there's no doubt that raw material price changes that may well have come about due to transport changes and other issues may well have triggered all sorts of interest in substitute materials. But that list isn't unique or definitive, and it's really important that the personal view is put together, and we often would have a brainstorming session with people and hopefully set it all down in a rather complex and lengthy mind map. But the idea is to generate ideas and scenarios that may well stimulate some thought as to future possibilities for business development. So having reached the consequence of a variety of trends, it's useful to produce some hypotheses for various areas where there may well be growth. And I'd just like to highlight one or two examples where there are changes and to categorize them a little bit in terms of different things that are changing. It comes as no surprise that there's very likely to be a little bit of carbon available if aerospace demand decreases. The question is, what's going to fill that gap? While carbon fibre may not change in price, there's no doubt that the processing of carbon fibre may well become more beneficial in a greater number of applications. But what is certain is that carbon fibre is here to stay, so it's going to go somewhere. That doesn't just apply to carbon, of course. Within glass and other aspects of composite materials and composite processing and manufacture using composites, there's all sorts of industries that are in either embryonic or developing that may well be given further traction into markets where the use of composites is increasingly adopted as a result of certain changes that have happened in the last few months. So we see that there are all sorts of various opportunities and a variety of industries where potentially things that might well have taken the next 5 years to happen might well be accelerated. Here's some examples of market opportunities. Any of you involved in turbine blade production will know that the length of the blade is getting longer and longer, not only because of increased efficiencies, but also the use of offshore turbines, or the installation of offshore turbines. And progressively, carbon is being used more for that area. There are a variety of other consequences of that, and there are definitely increased engineering and material challenges as a result of those changes. A challenge is an opportunity for anybody involved in this industry. Financial Times recently highlighted that a lockdown crisis might be a catalyst for novel drone deployment. And there's no doubt that a lot of the discussion that's going on about drone transport of goods around a city, even air taxis, and the use of these, either remotely controlled or controlled internally, is likely to grow as a result of the changes that we've seen. There's no way that you can have an air taxi within a city without it being vertical takeoff, and there's no way that it would be tolerated unless it was quiet and therefore electrical. And there's no way that it can be electrical unless a major problem of the weight of a battery is resolved. So that affects the construction of the whole craft, and may well produce a challenge and therefore an opportunity for new business. Taking it from single prototype to production of a full range means that there will be mass production. An increasingly efficient, automated, well-controlled mass production provides challenges and opportunities for all sorts of industries that are operating within the composites area. Likewise, electrical vehicles aren't just electric cars for private use, but also an increasing amount of use of electric vehicles for delivery of goods, supermarket trucks for moving around cities. As soon as you've got a new market like that, where the battery can be charged up every night, but you need as much space or as much weight possibility to transport in the vehicle, that produces new challenges, and new challenges would be a new opportunity. Another example might well be the potential to accelerate substitution of a material. For instance, PET structural foam substituting for balsa. Any of you who have been involved in sandwich panel production know that that is very much a composite area of activity, and putting a low density, high compression strength core in between two laminates of composite is a very common way of producing a stiff structure. Balsa's got very unique properties in having compressive strength, which is very much higher than any of the other cores, and as such has been designed for use in a variety of different degrees within the wind turbine blade. Additionally, while a lot of balsa is being used in turbine blades that are made in China, demand for turbine blades in China has not stopped growing. In fact, it is boosted enormously by the fact that certain subsidies are going to be finishing at the end of 2020. Coincidentally, there's been weather problems and political challenges that have limited balsa supply even before Covid-19 kicked in. Increased capacity for balsa production is very slow to put into place. It takes 6 to 10 years to plant a balsa tree and to harvest it. And so consequently, balsa prices have been climbing, and maybe some of you have seen that. While many markets have continually looked seriously at the idea of qualifying alternatives like PET foam to balsa, this is now kicking in big time as the numbers start to make the two uses very, very comparable. Covid-19 potentially tips the balance, even though many of the investment decisions may well have been made sometime at the end of last year. We've got news of Diab installing foam extrusion lines in China. Armacell have recently started up their production of a new line in China as well. I would very much doubt that the end of all of this temporary change to the supply of balsa will mean that the balance goes back to where it was. So it's very likely that PET change will stay put. But of course, there are behind all of these changes an enormous number of technical processing issues that will need to be resolved and will be resolved. Another area where there may well be a good chance of changes is within processing. Again, the Financial Times recently highlighted that they thought 3D printing could be a real source for optimism as a result of COVID-19 lockdown. Reason for that being that many people have now discovered how long their supply chain is and how international it is, and they may well see an interest in being able to shorten that. 3D printing or additive manufacturing is some decades in age, but of course started life making 3D models, and today is still dominated by model making and prototype production, and the day-to-day manufacturing process for additive manufacturing may well be somewhat limited to the high-value industries producing a hip joint or something like that. But there's no doubt that the attraction of having a printer rather than a warehouse full of 6 months of stock of your spare parts may well be an interesting area of study going forwards. And that's not just 3D printing of plastics, but also composites, as well as metals and other materials. So we generate a variety of potential hypotheses and growth options, and it's really important before taking that list and getting excited about the fact that there's really lots to get on with. It's really important to prioritize these. And so what we often do, having generated somewhat randomly, it may seem, some half dozen to a dozen opportunities, is that we prioritize them. And we like to prioritize things by two independent factors, an external one and an internal one. We define within the business that we're talking about the attractiveness, the market attractiveness of certain activities, both in terms of that market size and the market growth, and a variety of other factors, but they are factors for market attractiveness which is independent of who the supplier is. So they apply equally to our competitors as to us. They're not attractive because we're good at them. The other axis down the bottom, the horizontal axis, is the degree to which we are well fitted to that particular opportunity and have a good potential to exploit it. Do we have, better than other people, better than our nearest competitor, a stronger position, a better asset, higher skill? Is this an opportunity which is closely linked to the experience that we've gained over the last many years, etc., etc.? And then once we've prioritized in two different ways, we can then plot each opportunity on this chart. And it's pretty obvious that if it turns out in the top right-hand corner, it's both an attractive market and one that we've got a really good chance of exploiting well. So we would invest time and resource on that. However, before we grab those and run away and leave the rest of the list, it's very, very important to look in the other areas. Top left-hand corner, the area I've labeled as not for us would be filled with opportunities which are very, very attractive, but we have to admit we wouldn't be the best at servicing them. And it's important to take the opportunity to have a look at why we marked it down in terms of potential to exploit and what is missing in terms of capability. Is there a way of acquiring that by recruiting the right expert, acquiring the right machine, or even making a bid for partnership with another company. In the bottom right-hand corner, similarly, we have opportunities which frankly are ideal. They fit very closely to what we currently do, but they're not particularly attractive. Potentially, they're not growing very fast, or there seems to be something that is not quite holding it in the high level. So we could analyse that, and we need to just, before discarding those, check that there isn't perhaps a niche or a part of that market that is more attractive and moves it up the screen. Could be that focusing in on a certain part of that activity might well be more interesting than the other bits. And then, of course, the bottom left-hand corner, leave for others, that represents opportunities that we have carefully dreamt up, but unfortunately they're both unattractive and we're not going to be very good at them. So probably best to leave those for others. So we end up with some priorities to focus on, and I'll be teaching Granny how to suck eggs if I said that nothing will happen unless you properly manage the project of getting that going. It's important for us to define exactly what position we want to take in that new activity or new market, what resources we need internally and externally to put together, and if we can't achieve that, do we need to make sure we develop some partnerships either for marketing or for other aspects of production in order to service that market. And all the traditional activities of project management involving dividing up a broad action plan and giving it ownership of different people in the team, as well as having a risk register that highlights what could go wrong, what would be the cost, and what's the contingency plan for dealing with it, so that finally we have a solid plan for achieving what was going to tick all the boxes for corporate objectives that we started with at the beginning of this process. So in conclusion, I would like to just finalize by saying that the way we see composites is that the growth of composites has historically, rather simplistically, can be summarized as metal replacement. In fact, material replacement is a very fundamental part of composites, and very often composites have slipped in as a Me Too replacement, and then enabled redesign and various other changes. But by and large, it has grown to the detriment of other materials. But that progress has necessarily been very careful and been at a pace. And the status quo is often being maintained because the interest in changing and the advantages that come with change have been balanced by forces resisting it. And this is probably something which is common to any situation. What we see is that more often than not, changes occur when it's the resistance that falls away rather than the pressure to change that increases. And so as a consequence of that, we see a discontinuity like COVID-19 tipping the balance and catalyzing and accelerating rapid change and the continuation of the growth of composites, as has always historically been the case. So for us at the moment, the glass is half full. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Peter. If anybody has got any questions, can you put them in the Q&A box at the bottom of the Zoom screen? Whilst we're waiting for any to come through, Peter, I've got a question to start us off. You highlighted the material substitution of PET for balsa earlier on. Would you like to expand in any more detail about the properties, prices and availability of that?
Yes, I'm not a purchaser, so let me not throw too many numbers around without at least saying that they are approximate. But balsa, as I understand it, has moved pretty much from about $700 to $900 a cubic meter up to nearly 2,000. And the consequence of that has been that, of course, within places like Ecuador, balsa is coming into town on the back of mopeds. There's been all sorts of illegal people trying to get hold of balsa. It's suddenly a valuable property. The density of balsa may have changed slightly as well, up from 150 to 180. But there's no doubt that the price is going to be the biggest change that is being faced by people who are purchasing. PET normally is made round about a density of 130 grams, but in order to compete with balsa, you need to make PET foam right up at the level of about 250 grams, which is not what PET extrusion lines would prefer to do. That necessarily halves the production that you can get out of that line, and it also increases the cost quite considerably. So at that point, it starts to become a little bit level with balsa at the moment. So I think from a financial point of view, the two are probably neck and neck. We shouldn't forget that balsa still has 10 times the compressive strength, but nevertheless, there are an enormous number of organizations that use balsa and probably would be considering quite seriously PET in the future. So that's the driver, Claire, with regard to the wind industry. That's all assuming that, of course, going forwards 2 or 3 years, all the capital that has been sucked into rescuing countries around the world is still available also for investing in the wind industry. So at the end of the last recession, we did see the wind industry take a bit of a dip, it being a very capital intensive business. So there are other layers of change that may well happen.
Okay, thank you. There's not been any other questions come through. I think you've stunned everyone to silence.
Okay.
But if anybody does have any questions going forward, obviously the contact details for Peter are on the screen there. Oh, I think there might have just been one that's come through. Yeah, from Matt Bradney. On material substitution, do you think the substitution of e-glass with natural fibres such as flax and jute will increase? And if so, in which markets? Will the emerging supply chains be able to support the growth given its seasonality, etc.?
That's a very good question. I think there's been a lot of drivers in the area of natural fibres, particularly with regard to recycling. There's certainly attention has been taken up in terms of interior paneling in automotive areas, because of course there are very, very strong requirements with regard to how much of a vehicle must now in weight be recycled. And there is there's also talk about the use of natural fibres in other areas, such as the production of various trolleys and paneling inside aircraft, etc., in various areas. I think the issue of dealing with seasonal change is one which will be managed. It's a question of understanding how these things change. There are a variety of alternatives from around the world. So if the cost of bringing flax in from places like Pakistan becomes expensive, I'm sure there are other areas. France is still producing quite a bit of flax. And I think there is an opportunity for growth there. In particular, some of the industries where the recycling in, let's say, Europe in the automotive industry hasn't yet taken place in other regions. So in North America, a lot of the similar paneling would be injection molded plastic, and may well change going forwards if the politics and economics are correct over there.
Okay, brilliant. There's no other questions that have come through. Like I say, if there's any questions going forward, you can contact Peter directly or do contact us at Composites UK and we'll pass them on for you. So with that, we'll bring the webinar to a close. I'd like to thank you, Peter, for hosting us today. And thank you to everyone who's attended. We've got plenty of other webinars coming up, so please check out our calendar and we'll hopefully see you again soon. Thanks very much, everybody.